I'm really very pleased to be here. I am Connie Morella, and I approve this message. You're going to hear a lot about that within the 5-week period before the election. You know what I think is kind of interesting about that expression? It came about because of campaign finance legislation that the late Senator McCain had introduced with Senator Feingold. The campaign finance legislation didn't quite do what it was intended to do, but that part of it, in terms of transparency, disclosure, of indicating where the ad came from that particular bill. I thought that was kind of interesting. I am pleased to be here at Montgomery College, where I have deep roots and, as you know, a very deep admiration for what's being done here. As I came on campus, I could hardly recognize it, and yet I was here not very long ago because of the buildings and all of the changes, the signage, and the expansion that's taking place. I believe very strongly that Montgomery College is what we need now and into the future: affordable, accessible, and flexible. And this is how we can do our job training for other tasks that come along in this very progressive technological society. Well, I want to thank Professor Dr. Lee Annis for organizing and implementing such a program. As moderator, I have an enviable role. All I do is I introduce the experts who are going to talk to you about a very timely and important topic. And then we will, after their presentation, we will open it up to questions that you may have. And so it's a wonderful opportunity for me. I will introduce every panelist at the beginning, and I will ask that their presentation not exceed more than like 10 to 12 minutes. Otherwise, I will step in and tell them the gentleman's time has expired. I look forward myself to listening and to learning. I think this is a very important role. You know, there is a statue in the Capitol of Will Rogers, and people walk by it and they all touch his shoe, his foot. And so it shines, the bronze shines, because people have touched it for good luck. And it's interesting because Will Rogers was a humorist, and I really think that humor is important to handling crises and handling challenges. Well, Will Rogers once said, "The Senate is a place that starts off each day with a prayer and ends with an investigation." Isn't that amazing? That is just so true today, and that Will Rogers had said it. So with that, our first panelist is Ira Shapiro. He is a man of all seasons and all congressional sessions. He's got a sense of humor, and he's got quite a perspective. He is a writer, he is a diplomat, he's a globalist, and I must say, he is a friend. He was chief negotiator for Japan and Canada in the Clinton era. He served in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and of particular interest tonight are his last 2 books on the United States Senate. They are The Lost Great Senate, and the book that just recently came out is called Broken: Can the Senate Save Itself and the Country? Now, that's a good question. I had the good fortune to read, digest, and ponder both books, which are thoroughly researched and engaging reading. P.S. They'll be on sale tonight, too, but they are excellent. Next to Ira, up at bat, is Dr. Professor James Lee Annis. He is the chair, as you may know, of Montgomery College Rockville Campus Department of History and Political Science. Lee has been with the college since 1986, having taught at all 3 Montgomery College campuses. He's an incredible writer, interesting and informative. He is the author of the book entitled Howard Baker, Conciliator in an Age of Crisis. And with Senator Bill Frist, he wrote Tennessee Senators, 1911 to 2001, and Portraits of Leadership in a Century of Change. His latest book is a fascinating and engaging chronicle entitled Big Jim Eastland, the Godfather of Mississippi. Now, if you like I am, I thought, do I need to really read about Big Jim Eastland? I mean, he was a segregationist, but it is a fascinating book which shows many different facets of Jim Eastland and the fact that he is a man who understood power and fairness and working across the aisle. I got a tremendous takeaway from reading the book. Our next panelist, Dr. Jay Wyatt. He is the director of the Robert C. Byrd Center for Congressional History and Education at Shepherd University in Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Jay oversees the Byrd Center's research projects and its oral history program. He's the current president of the Association of Centers for the Study of Congress. Jay is co-author with Catherine Scott, who is here in the audience. Where are you, Catherine? All right, Catherine Scott, co-author. The book is called Robert C. Byrd, Tactician and Technician in the major book, Leadership in the U.S. Senate, Herding Cats in the Modern Era. I like that, Herding Cats in the Modern Era. He is the curator and lead author of the career-spanning traveling exhibit entitled Robert C. Byrd, Senator, Statesman, West Virginian. When I was in Congress, I used to say, you know, representing so many federal employees and agencies, I'd say we had to be very careful, because when you think about moving a place in an agency, Robert Byrd will move it to West Virginia. So that was always a cautionary note. Personal privilege on my part. My husband, who couldn't be with us tonight, has taught, he's now emeritus at the American University Washington College of Law. He had the privilege or the experience of being Robert Byrd's law professor. Robert Byrd actually, remember, he was elected without having any education. He decided when he was in the Senate that maybe it would be good for him to get a law degree. And so he went to the American University Law School, and Tony had him as a professor. He did not want anyone to know who he was, but of course they could recognize him, at least many of them could. And when I would see him in the halls of Congress, he would always say to me, not how are you, Connie or Congresswoman, he'd say hi to the professor, tell him I said hello. So there is something, isn't there, these students know, between the professor-student kind of connection that you always have. I'm sure he could tell some stories about that too, but he was a great man. Our last panelist is a really special guy, Senator Bill Brock. I mean, I even hold him in esteem in terms of his experience. He is a man of many titles. He was an expert in performing all the desired attendant responsibilities that goes along with all those titles. I'll give you an example. William Emerson Brock III served from 1971 to 1977 as the United States Senator from Tennessee. But prior to that, he was elected to 4 terms in the House of Representatives. He broke the mold as a Republican in a Democratic district. I guess I know what that's like. Following his Senate service, Senator Brock has chaired the Republican National Committee. He's been our United States Trade Representative, and then our United States Secretary of Labor. So you can see he's had many titles and handled them all very well. Secretary of Labor, from that, he is here as a labor of love because he wanted to come from Annapolis to be here to share ideas with you. He and Sandy, his wife, are very dear friends. And so you see, you got a terrific program, and I'm going to sit down and I'm going to listen and I'm going to learn, and then maybe with you ask some questions. So here's your panelists, and they will one at a time. If they extraordinarily exceed their time limit, I'll kindly let them know. Thank you. Okay, so let's start off with Ira Shapiro. Okay, Ira.
It's wonderful to be here and to be on a panel moderated by one of my favorite people in the world, Connie Morella. This is rather unique since in 2002, I tried to run for the congressional seat that Connie Morella was holding. She has never held it against me because she understood I was really running against Chris Van Hollen and Mark Shriver in the Democratic primary. I have 3 notes that have been written to me about my book that I have kept. My 2 books, one from Barack Obama and 2 from Connie Morella. So she's just a wonderful person. But thinking about my congressional race briefly, I was thinking on the way over here that I'm a Democrat. I worked in the Gore administration, the Gore campaign. We lost narrowly. I worked for George McGovern and Walter Mondale. We won 1 state each time, lost 49 states. Winston Churchill once said that success is the ability to move from failure to failure with no loss of enthusiasm. And that's me. So I'm still enthusiastic. I have a 50-year interest in the Senate. I came of age, like many of my generation, in crisis times, 1968, 1969, the Vietnam War, violence in the streets, the assassination of some of our heroes, the Chicago Convention, the period that then went into Watergate. At that moment in time, the Senate was a beacon of hope for many of us. It was the place where progressive legislation was enacted, where the war was debated and ultimately stopped, where President Nixon was held accountable for Watergate. And it was the Senate where large figures came together to solve problems for the country. They stepped up to these problems. The Senate, and so for my purposes, the Senate has always loomed very large in our structure. You need a place in the U.S. government where the parties can come together. And the Senate was that place. The 6-year terms, extended debates, both parties having to come together because of supermajority requirements, and they understood the need to come together and reach principled compromise. And so the Senate, for a long period of time, and Senator Brock was there, the Senate of the 60s and then the 70s was a distinctive Senate that actually worked for the country. They were people who believed in collective action, and they were people who believed that even though they were Democrats or Republicans, and they represented their states, they understood they had a national purpose. That's what they were there for. They were national figures, and they would have to compromise and take collective action for the nation. We haven't had that kind of Senate in a long time. The Senate, in my view, has gone down over 25 or 30 years, quite parallel, in fact, to the descent of our political system. Because once the room where it happened, Hamilton's room where it happened, where things got worked out, once that didn't work anymore, once the Senate succumbed to hyperpartisanship, then Washington started to fail. And when Washington started to fail, reasonable people around the country could look at it and say, I'll take my chances on an outsider. Donald Trump wouldn't be president if not for his unique celebrity, but he also wouldn't be president without the failure of the Senate and without the failure of our system. So where did it go wrong? Well, it went wrong over a long period of time. A gradual decline as it couldn't overcome partisanship anymore. The forces of centrifugal forces started pulling people apart, And the senators started becoming more partisan, and they were affected by a couple of forces in our politics. The politics of personal destruction, where people, the smartest minds in politics, dedicated themselves to negative ads and advertising, destroying their opponents, and the permanent campaign, where all of a sudden there was no time for governing anymore because all you did was go on to the next prepare for the next campaign. So the Senate gradually, over time, declined, and it treated us to some horrible moments, like the Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill hearings in 1991, or like the ill-advised decision to approve the war in Iraq, 2002. So the decline had gone on for a while. About 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago, what I call the gradual decline gave way to a deep dive. And that I would identify with the leadership team that came into power, and they weren't a team, unfortunately, Harry Reid, the Democrat, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican. Senate leaders, Senator Brock's time, the Senate I worked in, Senate leaders always felt the obligation to work together. They worked with the president, and they worked with each other, and they worked with all the senators. They understood their bipartisan responsibilities. They understood the need to build trust and to work on mutual respect. Sadly, Reid and McConnell were not like that. They became the leaders of the Democrats in the Senate and the Republicans in the Senate. But who was bringing them together? It didn't happen, and it kept getting worse. And I don't think the blame can be equally allocated, because McConnell, I believe, has been the dominant force, obviously since Reid retired, but before that as well. Senator McConnell, I have a special place in my heart for Senator McConnell. I think he stands out in historical terms as the most destructive Senate leader. I described him that way once, and there was some resentment about that, so I ramped it up to say he was the other threat to our democracy. But I think what you see is the simple part of the equation is that leaders, the fundamental role of leaders, no matter how difficult our politics, leaders have an obligation to bring people together, not to tear them apart, not to inflame every possible difference. So obviously I don't have to tell you the Senate's important, because we all have the Kavanaugh confirmation on our mind. And I think there'll be a lot of discussion about it. But in a 2-day period, we were reminded of just how broken the Senate was with that horrible experience in Thursday's hearing. And then on Friday, because of Senator Flake and Senator Coons and the support of others, we were reminded momentarily of the Senate's potential. It doesn't take that many people to stand up and actually bring people together. We'll see how it all plays out. That remains to be seen. And we'll talk about this more, but I believe that we will not have a healthy political system until we have a Senate that can again work in a bipartisan way and instill rather than tear down trust. I think that the Kavanaugh situation is a good illustration of how things can be handled and how they shouldn't be handled. I'm a great fan of Dianne Feinstein's. I've followed her career forever. But I think she mishandled the situation when Dr. Blasey Ford's letter came in. I was talking to Senator Brock about this, because in the Senate that I worked in as a staff director, the first thing I would have done was taken that letter and shared it with the majority. That's what you do. That's how it was second nature to us. Let's figure out what to do with this. There wouldn't have been any allegations of late hit or anything like that. It wasn't that hard. Other issues are hard, but that wasn't that hard to avoid. Can we have a decent Senate again? Can it return, if not to its past greatness, then to respectability? Yes, it can, if the electorate rises up and ends the Republican majority, because this Republican majority, unlike past ones that I lived with, this Republican majority cannot provide a check on the president and cannot make the Senate work because it has basically fostered distrust and partisanship. Anyway, I'll close my comments here because being a Senate guy, I can filibuster at great length, and I think we want to have time for the discussion. Thank you.
Ira's comments remind me of an interview I did about 5 years ago with Bobby Baker, who in the Senate of the 50s and 60s was said to be the 101st senator because he clung so closely to Lyndon Johnson and did all of his dirty work. Bobby Baker said in 2013 of that Senate, which Harry Reid was the majority leader, and I quote, "The biggest bunch of idiots I've ever seen." Now, Bobby Baker passed away last year. I can't speak for someone who's dead, but I'd be real shocked if he would have anything more positive to say about the Senate of Mitch McConnell. Now, what I am going to talk about primarily is a chapter that I did in a recent book, where Jay Wyatt and Kate Scott are co-authors. They did the chapter on Robert Byrd, but I did a chapter on a former boss, Senator Bill Frist, who is quite a different senator. I will say he is my friend. He was a great boss. I would call him the best majority leader in the last 15 years. You might agree or disagree, but I don't know that that's necessarily the best claim he would get. I will also call him the best doctor in the history of the United States Senate. Now, that may not be saying that much. When I talked to him, he mentioned the closest thing to a doctor from Tennessee was a friend of Andrew Jackson's, whose mother really wanted him to be one. There had not been a senator elected since 1934 who was a physician. But in Bill Frist's case, not only was he a doctor, he'd done 200 heart and lung transplants. He'd saved the life of David Petraeus, the general, from just a freak shot from an M16 at a camp he was running. In 1991, he had worked on Senator Ross Bass, operated on him for lung cancer. And while a senator, he saved Dianne Feinstein from choking. He I guess his first public act was to save a lobbyist for a school in Tennessee who was trying to ask for something. He gave him CPR and saved his life. His last public life was to treat Congressman Bill Broomfield, who served with both Senator Brock and Connie Morella in the House of Representatives. He saved him, or he treated him at the funeral of Gerald Ford. But not only that, you're going to find he became something of a national figure as a guy who treated the Capitol shooter in 1998, and certainly was one of his first jobs before becoming majority leader was to rescue victims of a deadly pileup in a Florida car crash. I think that Senator Frist, as majority leader, would not be as fulfilled as he might have been. His expertise is on health, very simply. And the one thing that he is incredibly proud of is something called PEPFAR. And when the last time I spoke to him, he mentioned a number of people he worked with. One is a remarkable Irishman, not Kennedy, Bono. He also mentioned a Democrat you wouldn't think of, a Massachusetts senator, not Kennedy, but John Kerry. These three guys had the idea of providing foreign aid to those afflicted with AIDS in Africa. And they pushed this, couldn't get the Clinton administration to act upon it, but did finally work in convincing a couple of evangelists, even Jesse Helms, and then Kerry and Frist found a big sponsor in George W. Bush. And regardless of what else you can say about George W. Bush, I think that even some of our more liberal folks in D.C. will tell you that PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Program for African Relief, will provide $15 billion to Africa. If you look at a couple of countries, you can find the life expectancy between 2003 and 2015 growing in a few African countries by 14 to 15 years. And that is the kind of good work the Senate has done in the past and can do in the future. Now, where did we go wrong? And I think Frist's experience is with, and this is a good week to talk about it, judgeships. And this was not a small problem. You can find that it's always been tough to get a Supreme Court justice through. A quarter have been rejected, sometimes for being too extreme. Sometimes the other party had a majority. Sometimes a couple of withdrew. I can remember, the worst one I'm aware of is a guy named G. Harold Carswell, who I think virtually everybody in the Senate concluded he wasn't up to the job. And that became more clear afterwards. Now, there have been some good people rejected by both parties, but the problem had been growing of confirming members of the courts had been growing more common over the years. If we take a look back to the 1990s, some people cited a Thurman rule, which no one can find an origin for, but it's named after Strom Thurmond. And that supposed rule is that you can't confirm a judge 6 months before a presidential inauguration. And so Republicans would complain that in 1988, 8 judges were held up without getting a hearing. In 1992, 24 would be held up. And one of the 24, believe it or not, was Chief Justice John Roberts as a young lawyer. The Republicans are going to complain about, or the Democrats are going to complain that in 1996, Republicans held up 14 Clinton appointees without a hearing, 2024 Clinton appointees without a hearing. And in the early 2000s, Republicans sensed a strategy. In part, they found through some emails that came to their attention the wrong way that part of the Democratic strategy was to block at least one, a couple of people from the courts for reasons which weren't that which weren't that connected with the ability of those people to serve. The one that Bill Frist was annoyed with was a guy named Miguel Estrada. And one of the reasons was after he got a majority of the votes but wasn't confirmed, the next year his wife committed suicide. There was another judge from Mississippi named Charles Pickering, a good man. I think Senator Brock, I think, would probably have worked with him in some connection. Regarded as a Mississippi moderate, but he had partnered with a guy who'd run as a moderate Democrat in the 50s and 60s. As a lawyer, he was branded as a racist. There was nothing to prove that. There was, and most civil rights leaders in Mississippi said confirm him. But essentially, Pickering is one who will just have his name put over for a few months as an appellate judge and then would drop the issue. But there were enough challenges in 2005 where the Senate sprung to action. And this is the kind of thing that the Senate used to do. 14 members of the Senate, including Senator Robert Byrd, Senator Daniel Inouye on the Democratic side, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, and Susan Collins, who you're hearing about this week on the Republican side, and some others whose names that a lot of you would not have heard, got together and came up with a compromise which said that every one of them will not allow a filibuster, which made it so that there wouldn't be a filibuster on any judge between 2005 and 2006. And thereafter, the Senate was supposed to come to an agreement in the future. But the Gang of 14 were the kinds of things that people used to put together, and thankfully the institutionalists in the Senate still do. Unfortunately, how many of them are left? Jeff Flake is leaving, one. You can look on the Democratic side. I don't know that there is a Senator Byrd any longer who has researched the history of the Senate, kind of like, say, Cicero and Joe Stump have researched the history of Rome and Greece. And, people do point to the fact that Merrick Garland was not accorded a hearing, which probably isn't a good initiative. But you know what? In July of 2007, Chuck Schumer said no Bush appointee will get a hearing except in extraordinary circumstances. So there is ample blame to go around. But let me just close by mentioning that there is a reason to reconsider reinstituting what Senator McCain called in his last speech regular order, where traditional prerogatives of holding hearings before the public with both parties present, working together amongst senators on either side. Again, there is another bill that Senator Frist would speak about. It's one a lot of Republicans complain about, but he got through, which established prescription drug benefits within Medicare. Some said it was too expensive, but Frist would work with some Democrats on this quite hard, as would some others. He said there was always one person present to make sure things were done right. He wasn't going to vote for it, but he was going to make sure it was going to go too far as Ted Kennedy. And there are matters in which people used to work together. I'd like to see it be restored into what Ira's spoken about, whereas both sides used to call for the national interest to be followed. Another story. We all remember Katrina. Our friends at Tacoma Park did quite a program on this a couple of years ago. But a lot of work was done together across party lines 50 years ago in a hurricane called Camille. And there, the person who told me most was a senator named Birch Bayh, a very liberal Democrat from Indiana. The guy he worked with is a segregationist named Jim Eastland. And they got help from the beginning from President Richard Nixon of the other party. Have you seen that kind of quick action lately in the last 15 years? I don't think so. We need to get back to that.
Give me 1 second while I try to remember my child-proof password. Perfect. Well, thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be part of this esteemed panel. I'm a historian, and I like to say that a big part of my job is taking big stories and consolidating them into smaller, digestible bites for audiences like you, for my classes. And of course, Senator Byrd's story is very big. He was elected to the Senate 9 times as the longest serving senator in U.S. history. And it was certainly a challenge to fit that story into the Chapter 4 leadership in the U.S. Senate. I think Kate and I did a pretty good job of it. All of that said, trying to figure out which parts of that story to pull out to talk to you in 10 minutes is an even bigger challenge, mainly because I think Senator Byrd would have a lot to say today about the state of American politics and about the state of the Senate. And I think that there's a lot within his story that is particularly relevant. I've spent a good amount of time over the past couple years traveling around West Virginia. The Byrd Center is located on the very far eastern tip of the state. And one of the things that West Virginians ask me a lot is, what do you think Senator Byrd would say about this? I think it's safe to say that he wouldn't be happy. I think it's safe to say that he would probably have a lot to say, because Senator Byrd generally did have a lot to say. Thankfully, Senator Byrd was a bit of a historian himself, and he authored several books, including one published in 2004 called Losing America, Confronting a Reckless and Arrogant Presidency. And that book was published in the aftermath of 9/11 and our entrance into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I want to share with you a passage from the end of the introduction. Senator Byrd wrote, "I hold a deep personal appreciation for the bedrock importance of our Constitution and the wisdom of its framers. Only the Constitution's genius affords our people the powers and prerogatives that truly keep us a free nation, most centrally through the maintenance of checks and balances and separation of powers. For a long while, I have viewed with dismay each and every assault on the separation of powers and the continual grasping and groping for more and more power by presidents of both political parties. How can we be so comatose as a nation when so many damaging and radical changes are thrust upon us?" So extrapolate that. From that what you will over the past 15 years. The book was largely framed as something of a Jeremiad against the George W. Bush administration when it was published. And depending on which side of the political aisle you fell on, would tend to determine whether you concurred with Senator Byrd's assessment or whether you disagreed. One of the interesting things that's sort of lost in all of the conjecture about his argument is that ultimately he was really talking in a lot of ways to his colleagues in the United States Senate, because Byrd was upset and he upbraided his colleagues for what he thought was an all too willingness to acquiesce to the demands of the executive. And he just found that to be problematic. He found it to be essentially a violation of what their oaths were as members of the Senate, and he found it a violation in some ways of everything that he had worked for over his career. Because Byrd believed that for the government to function properly and for the nation to function properly, Congress had to assert itself as a co-equal branch of government, and it had to be willing to act as a proactive check on the other branches, most specifically the executive branch. So this is one of the core conclusions I think that Kate and I reach in the chapter about Senator Byrd's time in the leadership and his legacy. And there's numerous examples throughout Senator Byrd's career where we sort of see this kind of come to the fore, his belief that Congress, and particularly the Senate, needed to act as an independent and autonomous body. And I'm going to try to share a couple with you within a very short period of time. Senator Byrd was known for sort of pulling out his pocket constitution and sort of reciting from it. I'm not sure why he pulled it out, because I'm fairly certain he had it memorized, but he just sort of wanted to know, everyone to know, I think, that he carried it with him, always close to his heart. And it was sort of with the Constitution in mind that Senator Byrd very frequently said that he worked with, not for, presidents. Thinking about when he assumed the position of Senate Majority Leader in January 1977, Byrd addressed the Democratic caucus and said, "I shall work with you in fulfilling the Senate's proper role in our tripartite system of government. The people have a right to expect a Senate that will meet its constitutional responsibilities in foreign affairs and domestic matters as fully and objectively under a Democratic president as it would under a Republican. And this speech came 2 weeks before Jimmy Carter's inauguration, and as Democrats were seizing unified party control of Congress for the first time in 8 years. So it was not a small thing to say. I think it's easy to be cynical sometimes about the quotes that we pick in this day and age, but Senator Byrd, if you go back through his record, was certainly a senator who put his money where his mouth was. He did not practice fealty to any particular executive administration, nor to his party, oftentimes to the chagrin of his colleagues. This made itself self-evident to members of the press within a year. By late 1977, Senator Byrd's lack of fealty to President Carter's legislative agenda was garnering him fairly significant criticism in the press. He was criticized specifically for breaking up President Carter's national energy bill, which was a central part of his domestic agenda. He broke it up into 6 component parts as leader and assigned each to their respective committees of jurisdiction. And in that committee process, they were widely picked apart. The Senate eventually passed an energy bill, but it was a far cry from the one that the executive branch wanted and that was passed by the House. And in defending his insistence in following Senate procedure over the whims and the wants of the executive, Byrd commented, quote, "The Senate has an independent role. It's not to be a rubber stamp for any president." And this is something that he repeated time and time again. A similar scenario played out through the fall of 1977 and into the spring of 1978, when Senator Byrd and Minority Leader Howard Baker, the Republican leader, worked together to shepherd the Panama Canal treaties through the Senate. As the negotiations over the treaties progressed through 1977, Senator Byrd informed the Carter administration that the fate of the treaties rested in the hands of the Senate, which he didn't, apparently President Carter did not take too well to. Byrd apparently told administration officials, "You're not going to get a treaty without me, and you're not going to get a treaty without Senator Baker," i.e., we're going to do this our way, or you won't get what you want. So, in the end, the Senate eventually consented to the ratification of the treaties in the spring of 1978 after 9 weeks of debate. Another example of Byrd's enduring belief in the importance of the Senate's independence, regardless of the fact that this created friction with the presidents he served with and with other senators who were more amenable to toting an administration line. President Carter very famously said in one of his memoirs that he felt at the time that Byrd had stabbed him in the back. As the Senate Minority Leader, after Democrats lost the Senate in 1980 with the Reagan wave, Senator Byrd continued working in this manner. He was enraged when Senate Republicans used the budget reconciliation process to pass what at the time were the largest tax cuts in American history, rather than debating, that is, the cuts under normal procedures. In 1985, in response to what he viewed as an ongoing abuse of the budget reconciliation process, Senator Byrd introduced an amendment that strictly defined what provisions could and could not be included in the reconciliation bills. The Senate unanimously adopted what's come to be known as the Byrd Rule. They made it permanent in 1990, and it is still around today. For those of you who followed last year's tax cut battle, they had to deal with the Byrd Rule as they attempted to advance that through reconciliation. During the 90s, Senator Byrd famously delivered 14 speeches from memory on the Senate floor, tracing, of all things, the demise of the Roman Senate. His argument was that the Roman Senate effectively ceased functioning as an autonomous body the moment it gave up the power of the purse, the power to determine what monies got spent and where they got spent. The reason behind all of these speeches, which he delivered from memory, was to sway Democratic and Republican senators away from voting for the line item veto, which promised to give presidents the capacity to strike items from the federal budget that they didn't like. And despite the impressive capacity of Senator Byrd to deliver these speeches, they didn't work. The Senate passed the Line Item Veto Act. President Clinton signed it into law in 1996. But undeterred, Senator Byrd filed suit to challenge the law in a case that went to the Supreme Court, a case called Raines v. Byrd. The Supreme Court ruled that that Byrd and the other members of Congress who brought the suit lacked standing, but it was Byrd's efforts in this case that basically paved the way for New York v. Clinton, the lawsuit that eventually resulted in the Supreme Court's ruling that the line item veto was unconstitutional. It was unconstitutional because it gave presidents unilateral power to amend or repeal legislation passed by Congress. A no-no. And of course, there was Senator Byrd's very public opposition to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which he feared would legitimize a policy of preemptive war. He also felt and was afraid that that policy would push Congress's role in determining when and where and how we went to war to the side. In his famous speech called "We Stand Passively Mute," Byrd called out his Senate colleagues for not adequately debating the wars and their potential costs, and in that, for abdicating the decision-making process to President Bush. In his speech, Byrd lamented, "This chamber is, for the most part, silent, ominously, dreadfully silent. There is no debate, no discussion, no attempt to lay out for the nation the pros and cons of this particular war. There is nothing." So, coming back again and again, repeatedly, we see Senator Byrd sort of falling back on this idea that, as Ira said, for things to work right, the Senate needs to work right. And it's not on his, it's not solely his duty, it was everyone's duty. And he held them responsible for it. And it made him unpopular at times, but nonetheless a core part of his enduring legacy in the Senate, I think. Thank you.
Maybe I can bring this down to the personal level with a couple of stories. I was, I think it was Connie or Ira said something about my first race for Congress in a seat that had been Democrat virtually since the Civil War down in Tennessee. And I won, and my late wife and I had not finished unpacking our little house on Quebec Street in Cleveland Park here. And the phone rang. "Bill?" "Yes." "This is Estes Kefauver." Estes Kefauver was the United States Senator from Tennessee, Democrat, and run for president. And he said, "Nancy and I were just talking. We'd like to welcome you to Washington. We'd like to have a little dinner party for you to introduce you to some of the people that count." That was my beginning in Washington, D.C., where we talked to each other. Over the years, I got to be very close with Daniel Patrick Moynihan, truly a liberal Democrat, but probably the brightest man I ever met in politics. Was not afraid to take on his own party or mine. But we were just close and good friends. I had the same acquaintance with Hubert Humphrey, who Ira and his team rejected in Chicago. In the Senate, I was in a Government Operations Committee hearing. We were talking about the fact that the White House had too much power and the Congress was not establishing its role, primarily because we didn't control the budget process, as we thought the Constitution required. So we were debating whether or not we should have a congressional budget. And it was, I thought, sort of a silly debate. non-conclusive. Ed Muskie and I walked out, and one of us said to the other, "You and I could write that bill in 20 minutes. Let's go do it." We went to his little cubbyhole office. He called his guy, Al Fromm. I called my legislative guy, Harrison Fox. We sat, and within, certainly not 20 minutes, but within an hour, we had laid out the parameters of the bill that passed the Senate as a Congressional Budget Act. I did the same thing with Adlai Stevens. Both of them, of course, were presidential candidates on the other party. It's just the way things were. You didn't think in terms of party labels. You talked about problems. And I think one of the things that's missing now, put it that way, we all had softball teams. Every Senate, almost all, had a softball team. We played against each other, and win or lose, we'd go out and have a beer. We talked to each other. Our families talked to each other. Spouses, children went to similar schools. And we've lost touch with that human touch. When I took over as chairman of the Republican National Committee, I got to know John Wyatt, who was head of the Democratic Committee. And we were having coffee. I doubt if that happens very often these days. And we were having coffee, and we were talking about the fact that the United States is really good at exporting Coca-Cola or Chevrolets. We are lousy at exporting our values, but that's what makes us different. We said, why don't we form an organization to do that, jointly of the two parties? We did. We formed the American Political Union, which became the National Endowment for Democracy when Reagan took over, and then we got the chairman of the two parties, plus the head of organized labor, Lane Kirkland, who was the best promoter of freedom I ever met in either party. He formed the National Endowment for Democracy that worked behind the Iron Curtain until the Berlin Wall came down. Still does, by the way. Promoting freedom. All of this was bipartisan. And a big part of it, I think, was I never heard anybody in the group that I lived with, worked with, respected, attack somebody else personally. We just didn't do it. We didn't question their motives. We didn't question their integrity. We might have thought they were from outer space in what they were proposing, but we didn't question the fact that they had a different life experience than we did, which may have brought them to a different conclusion. And maybe we could learn something from that life experience that would inform ours. It worked for a long time. And now I think Ira and I have one disagreement when what you said, that the Senate has to change, and it takes a leader to do that. I wish it were that easy. I think we've got to look at ourselves. I think we've got to figure out how to handle this ability to attack each other without looking each other in the eye. That's the threat of social media that just scares me to death. Somehow we have got to understand that when the majority of Americans say, as they do today, I've lost my voice, nobody's listening to me, they are right. Nobody is listening. This country's leadership, business, political, educational, has lost its sense of touch with the American people. I would give my left arm to have a presidential leader that would say, come on, We're one people, one country. We got common problems. We better do it together or we're not going to get it done. We are our own worst enemy right now. We're not taking the responsibility of building our political foundation from the bottom up. That's where people have a voice. One voice out of 300 million every 4th November is pretty small. But a community of people that form around a core set of values, working at the local level for a city council, county council, state legislature, can build a base around which their neighbors can acquire a sense that they too have a voice. And all of a sudden, you got people engaging again, not as people in a party, but as people who want to say, this country has got to be better and we can help make it so because we are involved. Not them, us. And until we decide to rebuild from that level and stop depending on Washington to tell us how to live, how to think, what to do, and start working at the community level, I don't think anything else is going to work. So I will leave you with the thought that if I could get elected, anybody can. So why don't you get started? Thank you.
That was great. You're a great audience, too. I was watching you. You were paying attention, taking notes. So this is the time now for you to ask any questions you may have. I'm going to ask if you would when you ask a question, just briefly identify who you are. I also am going to ask a question, if I may, and just ask our panelists, okay, so what do we do now? And then you talked about the past. You talked about the Howard Bakers of the world and those who work together so well. You see, the Senate has an opportunity that the House doesn't have. Remember, the Senate is elected in a state. They don't have to worry about gerrymandering, do they? Yeah, it's the state. The Senate has a 6-year term. The House of Representatives has a 2-year term. That makes a big difference. Each house sets up its own rules. So the rules of the Senate may be different from the rules of the House. So I'm just curious, just maybe 1 or 2 items so that we can open it up to the public about what you would change. Would it be the parties themselves forcing the members to get to know each other, to be in a room and not have the Democrats on one side and the Republicans on the other? Is it a better schedule? I mean, what do we need? Is it the public that should do something? I'm just kind of curious if there are a couple of things that come to mind as being a way to trying to bring the groups together and not have the tribalism. Do you want to start, Ira?
Got a couple of thoughts. And one of the frustrations that I have with the Senate is actually many of those senators on both sides are very capable people, and many of them know that they're in a broken institution and they hate it. So why don't they do something about it? While I am critical of the leaders, and particularly I have been critical and will be critical of McConnell, I'm critical of the followers. They don't have to be helpless lemmings going into the sea. They should push back. In the committees, you find, Connie, that there's still bipartisan activity when they sit down and really think about problems. But somehow, by the time it gets to the floor or the leaders, then they go their separate ways. So, number one, I would say the committees should assert themselves more. They work on important legislation and they shouldn't let the leaders scrap it. The second thing, though, is nobody's looked at the Senate rules since 1979. When did these filibusters that used to be real but rare become commonplace? And they're not even filibusters, by the way, they're threats to filibuster. Somebody says, you do that, I'll filibuster. And the leader says, oh, we can't do that, we don't have time for it. They accept these ridiculous holds on legislation. Somebody says, I don't like that legislation, I won't give you unanimous consent to go ahead. It's not impossible to come up with better rules. What you can't do, you can't come up with the rules in the midst of the crisis, and you can't come up with rules that are one-sided. You could say, we're going to study these rules, and when the next election cycle comes, we don't know who'll be in control, but those are the rules we'll have. So there are changes that can be made that would make a difference. It is extremely frustrating to see talented people wasting their time and going along with this institution that they know is broken. The other thing I will say, last thing I'll say on this and then turn it over, I've never believed in term limits. I've always thought competitive elections what you ought to have. Watching Grassley, Hatch, Dianne Feinstein, 83, 84, 85, I'm feeling better about term limits than I used to. It's not just that they're old. It's that they haven't made it work. Turn it over to the 45, the 50-year-olds or the other people and let them take a shot at it.
Interesting. Anybody?
Can I, excuse me.
Bill, did you?
The alternative to term limits is called an election. You don't like it? Look in the mirror. Quit complaining about who you've elected and ask yourself, why? What did I not do that would help us change this? For gosh sakes, quit blaming somebody else.
Okay.
Look, there are some groups that Connie is aware of that I'm working with. I think she is too. One of them is called Issue 1. Why do you think members are
Speak
not
for yourself,
here with
sir.
their families? Members don't come here with their families anymore.
Yeah.
Because they're running all over the country every spare minute from Thursday night until Tuesday morning, raising money, for gosh sakes. And 95% of them aren't even being challenged. But there's something about the overwhelming influence of money that is outside the party apparatus, so that the parties are going out to their edges very quickly, both of them. And don't tell me one's worse than the other. They're both equally screwed up because they're losing their touch for the center where most of us are. Okay, if you can get some way to deal with this whirlpool of money that is just so destructive, as it is being conducted right now, that's a step. Second step, there's a group called No Labels. What they do is to try to find people in Congress who work across party lines to solve problems. They call them problem solvers. And what they do, they get 40 members of the House, 20 Democrats, 20 Republicans. They're looking for more. If you want to get your members involved, tell them to join. And what they do is they go to these and they say, we will give you a problem solver some special support in your primary if you're being challenged by somebody out on the edges that says you shouldn't be talking to anybody in the other party. They're working for people that are constructive. We need to make that grow. Let's start supporting people that want to solve the problem. And that's for us, not for them. They're going to live with the system they got because they are responding to the system as it works. Okay, get off their back. Change them.
Good. Very, very good advice. Did you, Lee, or if you do
Yeah, I think that Ira and Senator Brock are both on point with what they're saying. I would also add that, one of my favorite stories about the colonial period is, when the Constitutional Convention was breaking up and Benjamin Franklin left the building, he was apparently asked by a woman in Philadelphia, well, what have we got? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. And, the idea is that this kind of starts with the populace, and you, I think, get on a certain level the legislature and the executive branch that you vote for. And if you don't like extreme politics, if you don't want that to be your political climate, then you have to engage. And people ask us at the Byrd Center all the time, what can I do? And we tell them, get involved in your local politics. Get involved at the local level. Engage people in your community and have these conversations, because what we see is when people come to our events, and there's a pretty wide disparity of political opinions there, people get along and they talk because they're in public and they're not behind a phone and they're not on the internet and they're not just contributing money. So I think that matters.
But you know what percentage of Americans work in, it's probably not true in Montgomery County, but what percentage of Americans vote in primaries? Period. 1 out of 7. Who do you think they're in those primaries? They're single issue. They're ideologues. They're people that say, man, if you don't do what I tell you, you're out of here. There's no give there. There's no constructive effort to reach the center. If you want to think about doing some reforms that'll start changing the conversation, start changing the law in Maryland that gerrymanders these districts so that Republicans don't have to work for the center and the Democrats don't have to work for the center. They both are locked into their primary where their edges are putting them in office. You don't like it? Get rid of the doggone gerrymandering and let's have an independent commission that will run the district apportionment after the census every 10 years on the basis of a compact and contiguous district that doesn't take into account party affiliation. And you've made a huge step forward in changing the essence of the process.
No doubt about it.
When I've talked to members and their children, some of whom are getting older now, they will inevitably say that that what's been said here by Senator Brock, that they don't talk about their kids anymore because they don't go with the same kids. They live at, the wives and children live at home rather than in D.C. When there's a pretty good argument to bring in your kids here to work, etc. Some others will say that members don't drink anymore together as they used to. Now, you may say that's a boys' club, but there were, many might make the point that a lot more got done in that era over a couple of beers in an office than perhaps in front of a camera in a hearing room. One other thing, members need to stand up a little bit. I spoke a little bit about the Supreme Court. One Senator Brock worked with quite a bit was a rather bold Air Force Brigadier General named Barry Goldwater. And when the first woman, Sandra Day O'Connor, was nominated for the Supreme Court, some of the religious right felt that maybe she wasn't pure enough on abortion. Jerry Falwell said, every good Christian ought to be concerned. And within a few minutes, Goldwater was on the air. His remark was, every good Christian ought to kick him in the ass. Sandra Day O'Connor, after that, got every senator's vote. People need to stand up to the ideologues a lot more today.
True, very true. Yeah. All right. Okay, let's hear from you. I think I see a hand here. Mr. Red Sox? I hope we can hear you. I think he's got a microphone for you.
I was waiting.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, 1, 2, good, got it. All right. Oh, you got a microphone? Okay, good.
How y'all doing?
So you can line up. Great. Thank you.
Can
Nice
you hear
to
this?
see you,
Okay.
Fred.
My name's Fred Evans. I moved here to Montgomery County in 1970 and started as a history teacher. The first year Wooten High School opened. I give you that perspective to give you the year.
He's got a great reputation, I can tell you. I've known him.
And then I retired in 2000 as principal of Gaithersburg High School when I retired from the school system. But that's just my sense of background. But I'm very frustrated right now because I have this phrase of history is a lie agreed upon. And I don't think that we talk enough about the realities of our history, that the founding fathers, many of them were slave owners. There were no women who were involved. if Connie Morella was alive before 1920, she wouldn't be able to vote, much less run for office. Just some statistical information. We had Japanese internment camps for American citizens during World War II, and I'll explain why I'm going this route. We had the Expatriation Act of 1907, where women who were citizens, if they married an immigrant, had to give up her citizenship. That happened to my grandmother, Milica Wonkovich, where she had to give up her citizenship to marry my grandfather, who was a legal immigrant, and she was born here. She was a citizen. So why do I mention all those things? I mention those things because, and I don't mean to disparage Senator Byrd, but Senator Byrd was a member of the KKK, and when he was a younger man. And I don't say that to disparage him, but I say we need to understand that and understand that context of history so that we have a better understanding of why some of the things are going on now, because we've had a long history of discrimination and prejudice, and even in that great era of the 60s and 70s, there was a lot going on. So I'd like the panelists to address that in terms of why we tend to ignore the realities of American history.
Well, I guess, can I start? As a historian, first, Senator Byrd would be the first one to tell you that he was a member of the Klan. I don't think it was something that he ran from. If you look back at his record, every time he moved up a notch on the leadership ladder, every time he, was considered for something, there was a run of stories in the press, sort of who is this guy, who is this parochial politician from West Virginia. When he beat Ted Kennedy to become Senate whip in 1971, Adam Yarmolinsky wrote this scathing op-ed in the New York Times, just castigating liberal Democrats in the Senate for basically turning over their part of the party to what was a Southern segregationist. Senator Byrd opposed filibustered the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He voted against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. He did not vote for Thurgood Marshall for the Supreme Court. And I think if you look back at his comments about busing and that sort of thing, even into the early 1970s, they're very problematic. At the same time, he never ran from it. And if you get into the interviews that he granted, he called it the biggest mistake of his life. He said that he understood it. He would carry it like an albatross around his neck. It would be written on his tombstone. I mean, he had come to terms with it, and I think if you look at his voting record, he had come full circle really by the late 1970s. He voted for the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. He voted for the Civil Rights Restoration Act in 1988, on and on. By the end of his career, he was getting A ratings from the NAACP. So, I don't think that Senator Byrd ran from that. I don't think he hid from it. If you want to sort of get at the larger issue about the stories that we tell, and if you want to know why people don't understand Congress, it's because we don't tell the full story of Congress. We don't talk about what happens. We don't talk about the process of what it means. People think that you're going to go out and you're going to march in the street, and 10 days later you're going to get what you want. And when I teach the civil rights movement at Shepherd, my students, they come in and they're jaded. They don't want to hear it. Oh, no, Martin Luther King is blah, 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 right? They don't understand that it took 20 years after World War II to get the Civil Rights Act passed. They don't understand that came not just from street heat, but from continual working through local levels up through the halls of Congress, continual pushing and forcing change. So why, as a historian, I think that most of these narratives are out there. I think if you read the New York Times, if you read the Post, there's prominent historians like Eric Foner who are writing op-eds fairly consistently. There's a thing called the History News Network that's running op-eds by historians. It's out there. Why people aren't accepting stories that they don't want to hear or don't want to see the full scope of the story, I'm not sure, but I think that there's a tremendous amount of historical scholarship that is addressing a lot of these issues. Definitely.
You're under an educational setting right now. Why in the hell do we have education in this country? What is wrong with us that we can't say, my golly, boy, we made some horrendous mistakes. It was insane what we were doing, what we, being great parents or whatever. My gosh, look how far we have come, and look what potential it gives us to make constant progress in the future.
Did you know?
I don't get it. That's why we're educating each other and our kids so that they have the tools to continue to make the progress that our parents and grandparents made over some very tough obstacles. And you're right, James. It was not easy, but they did it. We made a lot of progress. And I wouldn't apologize it for 1 second. Not a breath.
Well, I guess it's 50 years since we lost Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King, two people who spoke a lot to many of us about a more just society. Reverend King famously said, "The arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice." Well, it better be long, because it hasn't been bending toward justice for quite a while. I think that it's on our schools to teach civic, history and civic education better. But it's on all of us as citizens to do better, as Bill Brock said. I guess I believe that the long sweep of American history has been an effort to overcome the fundamental flaws, the original sin in the Constitution with respect to slavery and the treatment of women as non-citizens at that time. And we've made progress, and what's frustrating about it is that so much of that progress has been given back lately with leaders that are taking us, I'm afraid, in the wrong direction. And I've spent a lot of my time on the Kavanaugh nomination, opposing it long before the allegations came in, because I think it's fundamentally important to have a Supreme Court that doesn't have a right-wing majority locked in for the next 30 years. But, Fred, it's been a long struggle at every point, and, it will continue.
That was a very good statement also that you made, Fred. I think every one of us should have our own little pocket constitution. I really mean that. I forgot to bring mine tonight. I have several of them. But that little constitution will give you a lot of our history and what we did to try to repair it. And it's so succinct. It really is. And so I think it'll give you a good sense of history. I got to tell you a little story, though. The Congresswoman, remember Abigail Adams when she wrote to John, speaking of history as you mentioned, and she said, "Remember the ladies, else they will foment such a quiet revolution as will not be undone." I think she can see now it will not be undone. It is continuing. Well, when I was in Congress, we didn't have a special bathroom for the women. The men had one right off the chamber. But we found there was a room which was right off of Statuary Hall, and it was one that used to be the Speaker's office, and then it changed to be an administrative office. So when I was in Congress, we asked for that room. Could we have that room? Because it had bath facilities there and a little lounge. And so I learned about the history of that room. It used to be in Statuary Hall. That was the House chamber. That was the House chamber. And speaking of John Adams, John Quincy Adams became president. John Quincy Adams was defeated to run in re-election for president. He ran for Congress and he was elected. And so he was in the House chamber, which was Statuary Hall. He got a little heart attack while he was there. And they put him into that room, which later became the Congresswoman's room. And on a sofa there, he died. That sofa is still in that room. So in 1991, We named that room for Lindy Boggs, who had been Cokie Roberts' mother, who'd been a great member, succeeded her husband, of Congress. She was the kind of woman who could, on the Ways and Means Committee, she could say, well, darling, I think you meant to include women in that. And she'd say to the staff, put women in it. So she was able, with her southern drawl from Louisiana, to get a lot done. So, okay, we decided to name the room for her. She went there, and she looked at the statue of John Quincy Adams, which is in that room. And she said, she looked at the statue and she said, well, John, your father never listened to your mother, Abigail, but I'm sure now she finds some comfort knowing you are here in this room surrounded by strong women.
Well, I do want to say, and I've always written, that the only improvement in the Senate, today's Senate as opposed to the Senate of 40 years ago, is that we've gone from 1 woman to 22 or 23 women. But it's a measure of the dysfunction that the Senate, despite those positive, that positive direction and how good a lot of those women senators are, they haven't been able to overcome the dysfunction of the other 77 people.
But that's right, and actually Ira writes about that in his book. So I salute him for recognizing the fact that women from 2 parties very often find it a little easier to say, we've got to work together to get something done. So let's get moving. So whether you're talking about Susan Collins and Patty Murray, 2 different parties, or whatever the combination is, there seems to be a sense of that.
Right. You got a question over there?
Yeah, we have a couple more. Sorry to hold you up.
Yeah. Thank you all for being here. I thoroughly enjoyed the presentations tonight. I think 3 things that we have to get rid of as soon as possible. Number 1 is the Electoral College. Al Gore would have been president, Hillary Clinton would have been president. See if we can get rid of that. Second thing is the spineless Republican Senate that we have today. And the third thing, maybe it should be first, is the so-called president in the White House. That's about all I have. Connie, I just want to tell you, I'm the cousin of your friend Gus Anastasia.
Oh,
Your
yes.
old friend. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Love Gus. Mhm. What were those ideas? Oh, well, first of all,
I agree
you
with
got to
those.
take care of the president yourself. I mean, you know, you got to get out there and vote. I think voting in primaries. I mean, look at that last election. If you looked on the Republican side, you had this whole list of people. They never got a word in, you know, and it was the celebrity factor. And then beyond that, if you read Hillary's book and other accounts, you can see what happened with the emails and exaggeration. And I think it was a touch of misogyny in that too. And what were the other items that we need to correct?
We had the Senate, we had Trump,
what was
and the first one, in the Electoral College.
Oh, the Electoral College. They've been, you know, they've had groups, they've had committees that have studied the Electoral College, and they have never concluded that it should be eliminated. And the reason, basically, and I don't have all the reasons before me, are the fact that you have states like California that would kind of be heavy in terms of the lack of balance. But they have had some studies, and I can understand how, as you look at it, you say every vote counts. Why shouldn't every vote count? So I don't know what will happen. Did we miss another item? Oh, the Senate should assume the leadership, yes.
You got a question over there, Connie?
And
Over there? Or over here? I don't know.
okay, all right. 1, 2, promise you.
He's been waiting.
Yes.
I'm glad we have 2 trade experts on the panel, because in addition to being, my name is Gene Rothman, and in addition to being a fanatic Boston Red Sox fan, I'm a truly passionate believer in the benefits of free trade and investment.
Good.
And I looked with great consternation and anger at the president, in effect, starting a trade war on his own. I understand what he's doing in the statement that he wants to use this tactic to get rid of tariffs, but my point is, how can it be that one person can do such a thing that would have, if he's not successful, would have such dramatic impact on all Americans, not to mention Chinese and other people around the world that would come from a trade war? I would note that the Constitution, I believe, gives the Congress the sole power to raise revenues. A tariff is a revenue. I note also there's been no legal action. I mean, major corporations like Caterpillar, and I could go on, are opposed to what he's doing, but I haven't seen any litigation. And I wonder why the same reasoning that led to the Supreme Court to reject the line item veto wouldn't also apply to litigation that would say, hey, the president can't just do this on his own under the fig leaf of national security, which we all know is ridiculous. So I wonder what your perspective on that, particularly the gentleman at each end of the table.
You want to start, Ira?
I think, of course, you're right that the Constitution gives the Congress the right to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Over time, there has been a compromise that has evolved. The Congress sets the trade policy, and the president, through this trade representative, negotiate the trade agreements. The Congress presumably then votes up or down on it. But there's been an overall tilt in our system for a long time toward more presidential power. The difference between this situation and what we've had before, I mean, we've been fighting about trade for 25 or 30 years continuously, but we've never had a president who was on the anti-trade side. The presidents were talking pro-trade and sort of global leadership, and they'd fight with Congress and they'd find some accommodation. This has been a disturbing drift, in my mind, toward one-person rule. And considering it's particularly disturbing when the one person is that one person. So what's the answer? Well, to some extent, and Bill may have Senator Brock may have a different view, but I think to some extent there has been congressional pushback in that I think Donald Trump would have left NAFTA, taken us out of NAFTA, left to his own devices. Congress, Senate has indicated particularly, we don't want you to do that, and I think the renegotiation resulted from that. So there is some give and take and pushback. On China, very frankly, I don't think any president has figured out an effective China trade policy yet, but the one we have here certainly isn't.
First of all, I share your loyalty to free trade. It's the only thing in the long term that's going to work. It does give us the comparative advantage that free trading nations can achieve by working together in common purpose to open markets, to create a dispute settlement mechanism like the World Trade Organization. The problem we've got is that Congress gave the president the authority to use 232, excuse my lingo use, but it is that provision which says he can use national security as justification for a unilateral action. I don't think he ought to have that ability. I don't think any president should, to be honest with you, unless there is some extremist that we can make an exception for. But Bob Corker, Republican senator from Tennessee, has introduced legislation to take away that authority, which is precisely where you could begin the conversation and put us back on the right track. I don't like what we're doing.
Congress cede that authority because in the Constitution it says that the Congress is responsible for raising revenue. It doesn't say the president is. And tariffs are, to quote John Roberts, another tax.
You and I don't disagree. All I'm saying is that they did. And we're living with it. So unless you can stand up and change it, the reason that the U.S. Trade Office is in the Department of the White House, not as a part of the Commerce Department, is because that authority is supposed to be specifically related to the Congress, and that's where their authority derives. It's very different from any other cabinet office. So the fact is that whether we're doing the right thing about, I do agree, by the way, that Republicans in the House primarily, some in the Senate, insisted that Canada be part of this new agreement, which they won that fight. It wouldn't have happened otherwise. They insisted that we maintain some revision and improvement of NAFTA. It wouldn't have happened had they not made that insistence. So things are not totally hopeless, but the fact is that we're using the wrong reason in the wrong way to do the wrong thing. And that's
But you're
I
right.
pray that the new agreement will achieve some of its intended purposes. And I pray we can find an answer to China that is not on anybody's agenda right now, because we're not being effective in what we're doing. We may be creating a really big problem.
But Article 1 is a legislative branch. Article 2 is executive and then judicial. And the legislative branch needs to make sure they're part of that balance of power. We have a question here.
Tony Gualtieri, wow, okay, this thing is on. Tony Gualtieri, live around here, used to work at Smithsonian. Long story short. Okay, so I kind of have a question and kind of rhetorical question. Okay, I agree maybe term limits are not the answer for Congress and the Senate. What was the life expectancy back when the country was founded? Does anybody know? 70? Probably not, right? 60? Where'd the stat guy go? My point for that is Supreme Court justices are nominated for life. I'm not sure that they realize people live to be like 70, 80, 90 years old back when the Constitutional Convention was created, the only one we've ever had, which we don't have to just have one. But more importantly, okay, speaking about Trump and tweets and different policy, whether it's Senate, Congress, the president, how do you sit there and act as if we have a platform, the government, the Constitution, all this, to get across policy and debate things, when you could just be on a toilet at 3 o'clock in the morning and tweet, and all of a sudden that's not policy, that's not the official government stance on things, it's not even actually grammatically correct or spelled right, okay, even though it's defended that way. And how is it permitted for the US president to be on the toilet, okay, tweeting things to the entire planet, which everybody reads this stuff, and they look at this stuff. How do they not know that if he tweeted out there and says, we're going to bomb Iran like McCain said a long time ago, what happens if Iran launches, preemptively strikes against our forces? And he says, oh, well, that was uncalled for. I mean, and just trying to get across the flippancy of having the modern communications, Facebook, Twitter, all these things which we like cry about affecting our elections, when actual elected officials use them to actually manipulate ourselves and the rest of the world, whether it be by the trade, negotiators, or others. How can we, not just as people, but the Congress themselves, people who we elect, deal with these issues rather than just pillaring Facebook, say they lose billions of dollars, I don't even care about them, but how can we call them to account for permitting a circumvention of the actual political process by just some guy on a toilet, or me, if I was a congressman?
Anybody want to comment on that? Yeah.
Well, look, I'm very opposed to Donald Trump almost on everything. But every president has tried to find a way to deal with the constituent, with the country, and use whatever tools of communication have evolved. So, you know, Roosevelt found radio, Kennedy found television, Donald Trump has found Twitter. From my standpoint, the correction for people who don't like Donald Trump is the elections of 2018 and the election of 2020, and separately, the question of how the Mueller investigation turns out. I believe the usual objections to Donald Trump and everything about him should be handled through the elections, other than something that might be something that Mueller turns up about Russian interference in the election and collusion.
Well, I understand that using TV or other modern media is a way to get yourself out there, and we have actual laws for dealing with all these things, right? Campaign ads, and we know someone's a presidential address, they get on TV, etc. But I don't necessarily, from what I know, there's nothing related to that for Twitter. For me, it's not just President Trump saying this stuff. I always look at the next person. The same thing with Obama with warrantless drone strikes. It's, okay, you're okay with President Obama signing off on killing some dude overseas because he's a bad guy and he's an American citizen, no trial. What about the next guy and the next guy and the next guy? So how do we deal with this beyond presidential elections? I mean, does anybody in the Senate or Congress or anybody, would they even consider or think about, because that's free speech? I mean, could Twitter even block him if the president comes out and says, I want to kill all the so-and-sos, which is a violation of their own policies? They can't ban him. So, I mean, how do we deal with this current situation, not just with the president?
I don't think you'll find anybody up here, whatever our party, that would disagree with the criticism of snap words tweets.
I think we would all agree, but I want to say, unfortunately, I think you're finding other heads of state that are now tweeting. What has happened is it's become pervasive, it's been picked up, just like deterioration of language has been picked up. There are many things we can be concerned about, and that is kind of like Trump being a symbol of what others are picking up.
That's exactly right. And you wouldn't want any law that would stop it other than an election. You wouldn't like any law that would stop it.
Our last question. Did you have a question? Thank you.
I just wanted to thank you all for being here. I'm a student here. It makes a large difference for students like me that you all are here. And instead of trying to convey some of the reasons that I am angry and upset, because there are people far more eloquent than me that are able to do that right now, I want to ask you how you feel about some of these sentiments and philosophies, really, that I'd like to share with you. When you have a situation like that of the current administration, or you say things like the action largely falls to those who are able to vote and are going to elect our next officials, I feel that it hasn't been adequately put to you all that it is so often that it is in spite of our voices instead of in lieu of, that people that we don't all agree with, and despite our best efforts make decisions for us, come into a place of power. And so it is not only how can social media, for example, serve to not be a force of anonymous hatred, but it is also one of the best and most promising avenues of bringing us all together. And instead of warning us about the pitfalls and telling us what we can do next time, I would like to learn about how we can better utilize what we have and how we can fight against what currently is.
I don't even know the question.
So, I would just say, for social media in a positive sense, it can be used as a rallying tool, it can be used as an organizing tool. It's been used in the county that I live in to rally community members against unwanted changes to the zoning code, unwanted industrial development, and so you can use it for that, but in the end, ultimately, you have to turn out and show up. And I think we hear a lot about restrictions on voting. You hear a lot about county councils closing down voting.
I feel as though I very clearly pointed out the differences between what I am trying to ask of you, which is really more of a moral and a personal question about how you think that what is at our disposal, not what its latent potentials are, but what its best potentials are, can actually be utilized instead of what you see happening around you. This is truly a question of guidance. If you were 23 years old and a woman, not what you see is going on around you, but how you could best utilize what actually exists. I feel like I don't want to nitpick, but when I hear answers and I'm finally in front of some people that could offer a viewpoint, and I haven't been on the other end of this before, I don't want to be disappointed.
I think, one of the things that you need to understand, what we all need to understand, is that this system of government is not set up to move quickly. The Senate is not set up to move quickly. It was designed as a brake on the passions of the masses that would be reflected in the House. So when we think about where we've come, what the senator is talking about, when we've come from a nation where senators weren't always directly elected, we've been able to there was a process that sort of, an amendment that changed that. When we talk about the elimination of the Jim Crow South, those came over a long period of time from activists at the grassroots working through a system that they didn't necessarily know was going to benefit them. There was no guarantees. It's historical contingency. And so, it may not be what we want to hear, but if you want to see change, if you want to change the system, you can either get involved and work from the inside and find whatever campus group, local organization that's there, or you can try to work from the outside. And there are certainly organizations that have done that. And we saw the split with the civil rights movement over those very issues. Can you change the system or can you not? I think when you look at it in the aggregate, that's the decision. And it's slow, and it's not necessarily what everybody wants to see because it's based on compromise and incremental change. But that is kind of how the system has always worked. That's the way it was set up.
And I think we have to, for all of the failings that we see around us at this moment, I think we have to have a sense of optimism that we've had some pretty lousy times in the history of our country, and we have grown beyond it. And so with your involvement, thinking particularly young people, more than ever now, running for office, knowing that they want to be involved, changes can be made. I think that it was George Washington, when he was 15, he wrote, rules of civility and decent behavior. Number one rule, when in the company of others, act with respect for those who are present. And I think that bottom line is something that continues into our aims and aspirations now. Listening, learning, respecting each other. And so I hope that you will join me. This has been a great panel. I know we've gone over time, but you have been a great audience because you've stayed over time. Ira Shapiro, thank you so much. Lee, thank you for putting this together. Jim, thank you for the expertise. Senator Ross, you've been great.